This is the second Zoom meeting of JPPI series of briefings and discussions on issues that are critical to the Jewish future. Today's discussion will focus on the findings of JPPI's 2019 Structured Jewish World Dialogue, which was dedicated to the growth of the Haredi communities in the diaspora. This growth implies a high representation and sharing of the burden of responsibility, not only by the significant spiritual contribution of the Frum community, but on the practical level of activism, civil service, and politics. The dialogue was initiated to enhance trust between the dialogue was the first phase in an effort to lay out an action-oriented plan for encouraging engagement of the Haredi community in the Jewish organization. One second, I'm sorry about it. The dialogue was the first phase in an effort to lay out an action-oriented plan for encouraging engagement of the Haredi community in the Jewish organizational leadership, in the general community, and in national politics. We are experiencing these days very difficult times for our people. We will be able to overcome and to ensure the continuation of Jewish influence and thriving only if we will trust each other and unite. Then we'll make our contribution for Tikkun Olam in general. In today's meeting, the leaders of the 2019 dialogue, our senior fellows, Dr. John Ruskay and Dr. Shlomo Fischer, together with Rabbi Dov Maimon, who is leading the second phase of the project on Frum engagement, will present their findings. I want also to thank Malcolm Online, who just joined and was of critical help at the beginning of the process. Now, I would like to invite our fellow Dan Feferman to take over and moderate the session. Please, please, Dan.
Thank you, Avinoam. Good evening to those in Israel. Good afternoon to those in the United States. And welcome to what is essentially our second webinar series here at the Jewish People Policy Institute. As Avinoam said, the topic today deals with the growth of the Haredi communities in the diaspora and expanding civic and political engagement. We're holding this webinar tonight to highlight our recent publication, which is a culmination of last year's dialogue headed by Shlomo Fischer and John Ruskay, Senior Fellows, with contributions from Dov Maimon, who will also speak today, as well as JPPI Fellows, Senior Fellows, Uzi Ravhun, Stephen Popper, and this was coordinated by Adal Shibel. This is the sixth such dialogue project we've conducted, and each one on a different crucial and timely issue facing the Jewish people in order to facilitate a better dialogue between communities and between Israel and the diaspora. The summary reports of all of these are available on our website, and they are presented to the Israeli government. This dialogue is intended to be a first step, as Avinoam said, to build trust between the various components that comprise the Jewish community to ensure greater cooperation for a strong and secure Jewish future. As the population share of the Haredim in North American Jewry increases, how can we help spur a process of increased participation in mainstream communal institutions and of increased civic participation? This dialogue, I should say, was more delicate than others, which should be obvious to most of us, due to the degree of separation, the lack of trust to some extent, and most obviously, the lack of perhaps mutual understanding or common language between the Frum and the broader non-Orthodox communities. And we hope it can serve as a basis for increased collaboration and communication going forward. As the report points out, even if there is disagreement over certain areas, there's plenty of room for cooperation on issues vital to the Jewish community. I'll emphasize here that what we are discussing is last year's dialogue. Of course, there are connections to what is happening now, and we will relate to them respectfully. But the current outbreak of coronavirus in Bnei Brak, for example, is not our topic for discussion. We want to build on what we learned last year in the process so as to increase cooperation in the face of the current outbreak and so as to prevent and mitigate future similar occurrences. This paper is available both in Hebrew and in English for download on our website. A couple of technical matters before I introduce our speakers tonight. How this event will work. Many of us are new to this webinar Zoom format, and we are learning as we go. So I'll quickly, after this, present our three main presenters. They'll speak for 5 minutes apiece, and I ask that they do stick to that 5 minutes, as much as I would love to hear them speak all night. Afterwards, we also have three of our guests that we will offer to give brief comments. Please no more than 2 minutes apiece, and then we'll open the floor for comments, questions from all the participants. Our event is scheduled for an hour. Of course, if we see that people want to remain, we are happy to keep going afterwards and continue facilitating this discussion. Everyone who is not speaking is going to be on mute, and we control that. In order to comment or ask a question, you can click on the raise hand icon. So at the bottom of your screen, there should be a button that says participants. And if you open that next to your name, you should have an icon that allows you to digitally raise your hand, so to speak. And then we will be able to see that, and then we will be able to call on you and unmute you. If you have any technical issues or questions about how to use the Zoom platform or any other questions, there's a chat function also at the bottom of the screen, and one of our staff members will get back to you and try to help you out. We do note this event is being recorded, and the members of the press have been invited, so please keep that in mind. And although we ask that you do not record this event, we will edit and then post a recording on our Facebook page and website. Without further ado, I'd like to present, I'm honored to present today's speakers. The first of which will be Dr. Shlomo Fischer, a senior fellow with our institute and our resident sociologist. Prior to that, and prior to his retirement from being a lecturer at the Hebrew University, Shlomo then joined JPPI. He headed for a long time the annual assessment project. Since 2019, together with senior fellow John Ruskay, he heads the Dialogue Project. He's a graduate of Columbia and Hebrew Universities and has spent time at Haredi and religious Zionist yeshivot. Our second presenter is Dr. John Ruskay, who prior to becoming a senior fellow with the Institute served as the executive vice president of UJA Federation, New York, from 1999 through 2014. In that role, Dr. Ruskay engaged with and sought and worked to strengthen Jewish life in every segment of the New York Jewish community. And for this work, he's received honorary doctorates from numerous institutions, including HUC, JTS, and Yeshiva University. Our third presenter from in-house, I should say, is Rabbi Dr. Dov Maimon. And Dov wears 2 or even 3 hats for us. So firstly, he's a senior fellow at JPPI. He handles our anti-Semitism work, he handles all our work on Europe, and he handles all our work on the Haredi world. Among his action-oriented work, he is a member of the Israeli Governmental Advisory Committee for improving access to Ultra-Orthodox to higher education, and he teaches social change management in conservative traditional environments at Ben-Gurion University. So Shlomo, if you would mind leading us off in the presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start off on a personal note. I want to express my sympathy for the diaspora Jewish communities who are greatly suffering from this disease, especially in New York, in Brooklyn, in Borough Park. I personally grew up in these areas. I grew up in Crown Heights, and I went to school in Flatbush in Borough Park. My father davened in the Aguda on Crown Street for many, many years. So these events have a personal connection to me. I'd like to state that. At the same time, the intensity of the outbreak in the Haredi communities in Israel and the diaspora gives the issue of the relationship of the Haredi community with the societies that it's embedded in a special urgency. And that is our topic really tonight. So I'm going to start. So we had the dialogue last year. Just to summarize the technical aspects, we had 7 dialogue sessions in 7 communities. It's all in the report with 110 participants. Our conclusions are based on these dialogues, on our questionnaires and discussions that they filled out. Okay, so the first thing is the growth of the Haredi community. I'm not going to belabor you with the statistics, but of course it should be the birth rates and the fertility rates of the Haredi community are much greater than that of especially the non-Orthodox American Jewish community. We're talking about the Haredi women have over 5 children per woman, and that whereas in the regular Jewish community, in the non-Orthodox Jewish community especially, we're talking about in New York, for example, 1.3. So here we have a tremendous difference, and it's and this reflects itself in the age structures. 67, almost 2/3 of all the Jewish children in New York are being raised in Orthodox households. 30% of the Jewish children in the United States are being raised in Orthodox households. And this, in every community, the younger cohorts have a disproportionate number of Haredi in Detroit, in Toronto, in almost every place that we work. Okay, as the Haredim become significantly, numerically more significant, and as their institutions flourish, till recently, till a couple of weeks ago, they really flourished. The question arises as to increasing their engagement with and involvement in the organizations and institutions of the general Jewish community and American civic and political life, especially public service and politics. We know that the Haredim are already significantly involved politically, mainly on the local level, mainly out of concern for their own institutions. We want to explore whether the connection of the Jewish community to the political structure in the United States can be done not in 2 parallel tracks, but whether we can do this, do this more together, in a more integrated fashion. Okay, we explored several challenges to this direction, and that's what I'm going to be speaking about. The first is and there's several barriers to greater integration, to greater participation, and I want to make them clear. The first is the question of the enclave. Haredi society erects high boundaries of dress, of special neighborhoods, of education, against what might be termed the onslaught of modernization and secularization. And hence, one of the barriers to greater participation is that they do not want their children, their families, their population exposed to these modern influence. Perhaps my colleague John will expound further on this point. The second issue is that Haredim do not necessarily or do not want to participate in programs that federations and other Jewish organizations sponsor, that they religiously and in principle object to. Such programs might be Jewish education programs for interfaith couples, for LGBTs, and other types of initiatives of that sort. The third barrier, the third challenge, is the fact that within the Haredi community, the sense of home, the sense of community is to a large extent, or refers mainly to the Haredi community and less to the general Jewish community. This is not insidious. This is very natural. This is a community which places a great deal of emphasis on its way of life, and naturally they feel closer to those people who share that way of life. This characteristic, I would say, is more sociological than ideological. We have the example of the Jewish community in Agudat Israel in Poland between the wars, where because they were not a minority, but the majority of Polish Jews were still religiously traditional, Agudat Israel was much more involved in the general community. So this is an issue of demographics and sociology, a lot less of ideology. I would just add that this issue apparently, and this is, I think, obvious, this characteristic, the fact that the sense of home is more closely tied to the Haredi community, is obviously contributed to the intensity of the outbreak in Haredi communities. This is, of course, aided by technical factors that we also came across in our dialogues, which are that and that they play a role, and that is that Haredi in Israel, but also apparently in the diaspora, use less smartphones, are less tied to social media, and are less tied to the internet. So given these challenges, and given the difference in norms between the mainstream or the larger non-Orthodox or non-Haredi Jewish community and the Haredim, the project demands that both the so-called mainstream community and the Haredim stretch themselves in order to accommodate the other. That's the nature of the project. At the dialogue sessions itself, which I participated in, I think 5 of them, at the dialogue sessions itself, we found serious willingness to build trust, learn about the other, and enhance cooperation, especially on the local level. I will just say that there was much more optimism about this possibility of more cooperation and of enhanced integration outside of New York. New York people were much more skeptical and much more pessimistic. I think that's probably natural.
Thank you, Shlomo. If you could wrap up the thought, thank you.
My last point is that in the dialogue sessions, we found, and John will elaborate this, even people who are familiar with the other side learn new things that they had not been aware of, and I learned new things about each community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shlomo. John?
Good morning from New York. I want to, extraordinary to see all of you during these challenging and really unprecedented times. I want to reiterate, this was a first effort to explore these issues, to learn from them, and to be able to develop a follow-up. The dialogues took place in 7 communities: Toronto, Cleveland, Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. Principally organized by federations, but in many communities, including in New York and in Los Angeles and others, a range of people, some on this phone, joined with the federation in making certain that significant Haredi and Orthodox participation took place. These communities, as many of you know, vary on multiple levels. Just to cite 3 of them: 1, size, and that has huge implications. Simply the population, both general, Haredi, and Orthodox. The size varies. 2, physical proximity. In Cleveland and Baltimore, the fact that the communities, that is the general, what we'll call here the general community and the Haredi community, Orthodox, live so closely, means the interaction, formal and informal, is far more extensive. Third, the amount of support provided by the federations to the day schools. In some of these communities, I cite Detroit, Cleveland, Baltimore, and Toronto, it's extensive. And it can, for many reasons, both to strengthen the federation campaign and the number of schools. And that leads to extraordinary things. In Detroit, I learned a leader of Agudat Yisrael participated in the launch of a federation campaign. In a place like New York, where there are hundreds of Haredi schools, the support, well, it takes place as much less, and that kind of thing would not be likely up till this point in time. So the support of the federation for day school matters here. There are many other dimensions as well. As Dr. Fischer said, in all communities, there was an openness to more cooperation, a recognition that it was less than it could be, and particularly a broad recognition that there was mutual lack of knowledge about the other community. The discussions were rich, were robust. We heard the perceptions of each, the misperceptions, and at times the fears. More to be said about each, but in this time, just to begin this, I just wanted to note that. As Shlomo said, we did a questionnaire as we do with all. So all participants, only 110, a small sample, completed the questionnaire, 110 people. I'll just say a few of the findings. As Shlomo said, there was more moderate optimism about relations as they now are. Almost half of the participants thought they were satisfactory or acceptable, but that varied. In Baltimore, it was 70%. In New York, 12% thought it was satisfactory. 73% of those that participated in the questionnaires felt the Haredi should be encouraged and invited to serve on federation boards. And 70% felt that the Haredi should participate in community-wide planning, about Jewish education broadly understood. It also extended, to some surprise, 71% of the non-Orthodox thought Jewish organizations should be supportive of increasing government funding for Jewish day schools. This is obviously at the leadership level, but that obviously contradicts or is against the grain of what we've come to understood as strong commitments from the, quote, organized Jewish community about church and state funding of education. Majority of the Orthodox, 58%, felt that the Orthodox should be prepared and willing to participate in broad Jewish educational planning for the whole community. So there's more to say, but let me come to the recommendations which emerged from this first effort, both at dialogue, questionnaire, and the discussions that took place. Number one, I'll say three. One, on the issue of encouraging and greater engagement of the Haredi community in public service, in politics, so to speak, and this comes from the extensive role up till now Jews have had in these areas. This was an area identified. It needs a whole lot more discussion at the leadership level to figure out how that can take place. And also there's a recognition it is taking place in some ways. Can it be elevated is the issue. Number two, in the area of social services for the elderly and the poor and education, particularly on the area of education, federations and others will be encouraged to set up task force to explore areas where joint planning could take place on Jewish educational matters, both in the Haredi community and in the broader community. And in social services, there was a general recognition that issues of overlap and redundancy need to be explored. That's even heightened by the present situation, which will present new challenges. The third area, which was most promising and identified, is the area of community relations and advocacy, and I'll conclude. Combating anti-Semitism was broadly seen as something where the communities could come together to deal with that. Ditto Israel advocacy. Could there be enhanced ways of the official bodies, the bodies now involved in this, to enhance recruitment and leadership development for the Haredi community in both of these areas? When a question was asked by somebody about advocacy for Israel and the issues there, they said, please, this is now about the security of Jews. And there's a broad consensus that issues of both combating anti-Semitism and Israel advocacy are ones that are ripe for enhanced recruitment, leadership development of bringing the communities together. And that may be a first area to focus on moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And we will be glad to come back to John at the very end, who will be, I hope, kind enough to intelligently sum up what should be a great discussion. Dov, please.
Thank you, John, for the recommendation. I will continue from this point. Hello, everybody. So all the people we interviewed, either individually or in dialogue groups, agree that cooperation is a good thing and would be mutually advantageous. All the people we interviewed, either individually or in dialogue group, agree that Haredi civic and political involvement will be a positive move. We may therefore ask why, if everyone agrees, does it not take place more frequently? We see Haredi involvement at the local level, but at the federal level is still only beginning. Many people we talk to agree that in 10, 15 years from now, Haredim, because of demographic and economic shift, will be much larger part of the Jewish communal and political life. The role of JPPI is precisely to anticipate the future changes, identify the barrier to change, and facilitate a possible dialogue between the main actors. According to a study, things have to be done first at the local level, and JPPI cannot be the facilitator of ongoing local cooperation. Cooperation has to start with concrete needs and common goals. So as John has said, the field identified at local level are welfare, vocational education, advocacy, combating anti-Semitism. I want to share with you the experience of cooperation in Europe. In many ways, Europe, what has happened 20 or 50 years ago in Europe, sometimes is also happened in America. So let's learn maybe from Europe, because I'm in charge of Europe. In Europe, the Jewish community are smaller and cannot afford to remain separate. They didn't do it by choice. They did it by necessity. They were not prepared to it. It was imposed to them by shared threat and shared opportunities. I will mention three main issues. First, there is an attempt to ban Jewish rituals. For example, there is Shrita has been banned in many places in Europe, in Belgium this year, and 7 other countries. Brit Milah is maybe on the threat for the old Jews. It's also a problem not only for the Haredi Jews, or it's not only for Orthodox Jews, for all the Jews. It will make a big change. So, and second thing is anti-Semitism we have in Europe, which is very strong, as everybody knows. So security and community protection requires coordination. The local police doesn't want to talk with different groups. They need one Jewish contact. And the third thing I will mention in Europe is public funding. Similarly, to provide public funding for schools, social service, and welfare, the governmental agencies need one distinct Jewish contact. So what we see in Europe, that people have no choice. They make the decision to work together, not because they wanted to, but because it was imposed to them, and they are not ready for that. Nobody knows how things will develop 15 years from now in America. Even in 1 year, we don't know. At the local level, we have to set up local task force with representatives for both sides and start with concrete needs of mutual benefit. At the national level, it will be also a task force, as John mentioned. It's very important that we work on that, and we have to make it happen. If in Europe, Jews made the cooperation as a matter of necessity, in America, we have to enhance cooperation by choice. And it's a huge challenge. People do it, normally they do things when they have no choice, they are not ready, but if we anticipate and we can work to be ready now and to prepare what will be very common understood by everybody in 10 years, I think we'll maybe be all together better. Thank you very much.
Dov, thank you very much. We now have a couple of our guests that we would like to give the floor to for about 2 minutes apiece to offer their remarks. The first is Dr. Irving Lebovitz, the head of Aguda Israel in California. He was one of the leaders of the dialogue session that took place in Los Angeles last summer, and we'd like to hear about his experience of the dialogue and his perspective on it. Irving, please. Dr. Lebovitz.
How are you? Hello, everybody. Yeah, I don't really have much to report in addition to what's been said here so far. I think the dialogue that we ended up having in Los Angeles was rather successful. I think beyond what anyone thought it was going to be. It was very, very cordial. We had a lot of good discussion. We had a really high-level group on both ends of the table. And the one thing I would say, you know, we had come to some conclusion along the way about trying to look at the low-hanging fruit. Something like anti-Semitism would be a good thing to start working together on as a project. And in the discussion, what came forward, much to my surprise, was Jewish education. And the feeling that we ought to maybe sit down as a group and start working on the funding of Jewish education, which was, as mentioned, something that's not been traditionally something which the non-Orthodox Jewish community has been very much in favor of, and very much welcome that moving in that direction. I've had a couple of meetings, not really taking too much forward. We're kind of waiting for the next step here. But I think that that's a very, very promising thing. And I'm kind of excited about the fact that we're going to be able to hopefully start to have that type of a discussion. So that's basically my report.
Thank you, Dr. Lebovitz. We'd now like to ask Professor Stephen Windmueller, who is the Rabbi Alfred Gottschalk Emeritus Professor of Jewish Communal Service at the Hebrew Union College, JIR in LA, and has a distinguished career both in academics and in public service. Professor Windmueller, please.
Thank you. It's good to see my friend Irving on the call as well. I applaud this effort as an extraordinary first step, but want to take a step back to suggest that actually there have been for some years efforts to create such kinds of contexts and relationships. For example, the Council on Jewish Life, which existed here in Los Angeles during the 1970s and 80s, initiated an intra-Jewish dialogue at the time designed to begin to open these doors. While it never really was able to grow and manifest itself, it represented a model of how a community might begin to open such conversations and create these types of initiatives. Earlier in my career as a Federation executive in upstate New York, I had the occasion to realize that backdoor channels were far more successful and possible than often public expressions or connections. So for example, rabbis coming to participate in the community who were sitting outside of the boards of rabbis were much more comfortable working through federations or through neutral institutions to be able to create conversations that allowed them to speak with their colleagues. I think sometimes we have to think about the principle that we begin with a kind of ability to touch key leaders using these kinds of channels, whether they are backdoor or more direct. During my tenure as the JCRC director in Los Angeles, we were able to open some conversations again with rabbinic leadership from the yeshivish community in trying to build ways of representing their interests. This is a difficult task, but it is certainly one that now needs to be brought much more forward in light of both what is happening in our society at the moment and the shared interests of fighting anti-Semitism, building Jewish education, and promoting Jewish peoplehood. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And lastly, we'd like to call on Malcolm Honline, who I believe is with us, and I will unmute him now. Malcolm needs little introduction, but of course, he is the executive vice chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations and has fulfilled that role exceptionally well since 1986 and had a crucial role in getting this dialogue project up and running. Malcolm, please.
We have to acknowledge the fact that all the rules have changed in the last couple of weeks and nothing will be the same afterwards. I think we can restart all our calculations because of the impact, which will be both negative. I think the image of Haredim has suffered greatly in the last few weeks around the world amongst non-Jews, but even more so amongst Jews. And just the emails I received is a testament to that. It's very disturbing and something that we have to consider and think about, rebuilding the image and while a minority, the ones responsible for the negative pictures and things, the fact is that the whole community is being accused. That's on the one side. On the other hand, I think that the needs that will arise from this and the outreach, whether it's feeding people, others by the general community that is affecting the Haredi community and the interactions that have resulted could be a positive on which we could build. Again, I think the reference to the local level is very important. When I came and started the JCRC in New York, I found that there was absolutely no relationship between the Haredi communities and the leadership of the community. And we started by visiting in Borough Park and Crown Heights. And for the vast majority of the leadership were never there before. Today, that would be unthinkable. But the fact is that the connections are still very limited. And perhaps as a result of the virus, the rules can change, that we can focus on common needs, not only issues that divide, but issues that will unite. And it is going to be a severe crisis, especially Jewish education, Jewish poor, and maybe out of these lemons, we can make lemonade in finding a way that we work together to educate each other about these communities, the very work that lies at the core of what you are doing and the important contribution you have made to this could be the foundation to expanding that cooperation to address these crises. You know, the resources aren't going to be there for everything, and there's going to be so many long-term changes that I foresee as a result of this, that maybe we can use this as an important launching pad, and especially working together to see how the institutions can be strengthened and how we make sure that aid goes to these communities, but that there's a dialogue about setting priorities.
Thank you, Malcolm. Before we go to comments and questions, and I see one hand being raised already, I'll remind you that if you open up the participants list, you can click on raise hand function. If you're having a problem with that, open the chat function and chat with us. If you happen to have a phone and you're doing this from your phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to mute and unmute yourself. Deborah Nussbaum Cohen, please.
I had to unmute myself.
There you go.
Thank you. Two questions, really. I know personally that women are often some of the most powerful leaders in the Haredi community, although they're not the formal leadership. I wonder if there was female participation, because only men have been speaking today. So I wonder how much women were recruited to participate in these dialogues. My main question is, I think the January rally in New York against anti-Semitism, against hate, was actually a good example of some of the issues you're talking about. The anti-Semitic violence was directed primarily at the Haredi communities here in Brooklyn and in New Jersey. Yet there was almost no Haredi participation in this enormous community-wide rally. And there was a lot of resentment. I heard from Haredi folks I know that they weren't specially invited. I'm not sure exactly what took place behind the scenes, but it seemed unfortunate and ironic that, or paradoxical, that this was the case. And I wonder, maybe from John or others, Malcolm, who are in New York, if you can explain why this played out the way it did.
I'm delighted to jump in. Number one, yes, there was female participation in the dialogues, and in fact, certain people certain female leaders of the Haredi community were key in helping us mobilize them, and they also participated. So that's Aleph. On the rally, I would say the following. As you know, the very act of going to Brooklyn, and this was in part in response to what had taken place in Brooklyn, was an effort to, in fact, reach out. And I'm very proud, to be quite honest, that my successor, Eric Goldstein, and UJ Federation was critical in making this happen in a very important moment. Yes, there was modest if any, Haredi participation, but as we all learned through this process, Haredi participation does not take place in mixed gender settings if it's a shiur, for the most part. So the question of how to structure and plan such a setting so there could be, I want to say, as you know, there was Haredi participation visually through video. But in fact, such mixed gender things where there's dancing, etc., is not something that the Haredi community does on its own. And we learned in the Los Angeles Federation dialogue, the Los Angeles dialogue, and we heard about had an earlier crisis when I believe it was Gaza or Intifada, etc. And the Haredi community there participated in a parallel way. And they came, but they couldn't go to the broader one, so they had a parallel one. And I would say to you, Deborah, I think your point is well taken. What are the lessons that need to be learned from this? How do we find ways where in community-wide events, they can take place in ways which are effective, impactful, and respect both communities? That's part of the agenda moving forward. And I think there's a readiness, as your question reflects, for this, in part from some of the frustration. And we need to do a better job, in my view, educating the non-Haredi community that they're not coming to a place where there's the music and dancing, et cetera, on a mixed gender level. They can't for their reasons. We need to accept that and figure out a way to do this together, in my view. But that's a subject moving forward, for us moving forward.
Thank you, John. Shlomo, would you also like to comment on those questions?
Okay, I'll just make one comment. I live in Jerusalem. I don't live in New York, but I lived in Har Nof for 35 years. And in my experience, you have to get used to different norms. In my experience, even in Har Nof, Haredim do not believe in mass participation in mixed communal activities. They do send symbolic leadership. They send people who are designated to represent the community. I understand that such people were present by video in the Brooklyn demonstration. I think that you have to people, and that was part of the process, have to learn about each other, about each other's norms, about each other's expectations, because I think it was, in a certain sense, unrealistic to expect, for the reasons that John listed, and for this reason, I think it was unrealistic to expect mass Haredi participation. It's not what they do. They do that in their own events. They don't do that in community-wide events. They send delegations. They send symbolic representation, in my experience, in Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thank you, Shlomo. Rabbi Avi Shafran, perhaps you would like to comment? Sorry for calling on you out of the blue.
Very happy to hear what John and Shlomo are saying, because I do believe. Am I muted or unmuted?
No, we're here.
Thank you. Yeah, I understand Deborah's concerns, and I think that they're well addressed by what John and Shlomo said. There's no question that the norms of the Haredi community are seen as, if they're seen at all, and they often are not even seen, they're not recognized. But when they are recognized, they're seen as bizarre through the eyes of someone who isn't part of the community, I guess. And for a number of reasons, many of the gatherings and initiatives that are taken by the larger community are simply not joinable by many Haredim. That's unfortunate, but it is a fact, and it's based, as someone mentioned, on principle. And I applaud John and Shlomo's recognition of that. And I do feel that, we don't want people to toe to our standards, to force anyone. But the bottom line is, if you're going to have a party and you want Haredim to come and you serve food that isn't kosher, it's going to be a problem for people. Obviously, gathering against anti-Semitism where there are mixed crowds or where there's a singer or whatever it might be is not quite the same, but it's on that spectrum. And I think that greater sensitivity from both sides, sensitivity among Haredim to the importance of joining the larger klal, which is an ideal, even in a Haredi mindset, that has to happen. And on the other hand, the larger Jewish community has to recognize the limitations under which Haredim perforce operate. And I think that the closer we get to those two, bringing those two ideals, those two attitudes together, the more we'll be able to promote greater cooperation among all Jews.
Anyone else would like to comment at this time? We have with us perhaps someone who can offer a different example of cooperation from my experience in the Northern Indiana Federation. Simon Springer's with us, who kind of is the bridge between the Frum community and the mainstream community. So perhaps Simon can offer us a bit of his personal experiences of kind of doing what we're talking about on a regular basis, and from what I saw successfully. Simon?
Thank you, Dan. You have to excuse me, I'm outside because my kids are home and still in school. What I found here, at least, and I'm originally from Seattle. I lived in New York for 15 years, and I moved here to, restart it, as they say. One of the things that I've found is that I heard a lot of talk about anti-Semitism and working together, finding the common good, etc. One of the things I've found is beyond. It can go even beyond the Jewish life, but it's just being a human being, right? It's not just about education. While education and engagement is extremely important within the Jewish community itself, focusing on things like making a living, a parnasa, in northern Indiana, in South Bend, one of the things that we find here is that people are underemployed or unemployed, and they need the help to come up, whether it's in the Frum community or it's in the non-Orthodox community. That's something we can all get together on. And once you start building that contextual relationship between the two many faceted parts of the community, whether you wear a yarmulke or whether you keep kosher or whether you don't makes no practical difference, because you can become friends. You can become someone that can actually move forward without the aesthetic stuff of a beard and a yarmulke. And in terms of the public policy stuff, I personally am involved with a lot of the local politics, with the mayor and the economic development stuff. This is stuff that is important to everyone, not just one faction of the community, but the entirety of the community. And then someone like Mr. Heinlein, I've been watching him for years. I'm from way back. I've seen him with governors and state representatives and national representatives, being that liaison, being the representative in a nice, orderly manner without putting yourself out there, has become extremely important. And as we've moved on from because of this virus stuff, where a lot of just the outside noise is dropping, people are starting to say hi to each other again on the streets. That's when you can really make the move to better your community or better the community in general. I don't really know what else to add, but thank you so much for setting this up. This has been really incredible.
Thank you, Simon. Dov, you wanted to say something? There, you're unmuted, Dov. Dov?
Yes, I would like to say that we have to understand, and the question of Deborah is really important. I mean, we have two communities who have been used to work separately for decades.
Dov, try to improve your reception or your Wi-Fi connection.
Their own system.
Okay. Lost Dov for a little bit.
Yeah.
There's anyone else? Dov?
I don't know. I stopped the Wi-Fi because it seems like I have a problem with my Wi-Fi. Do you hear me? Do you hear me now?
You sound a little choppy.
Do you hear me now? Yeah. Strange. Do you hear me?
We'll try to improve. Dov, are you in a better place now? Dov?
No.
Okay. We'll put Dov on mute for now while he tries to improve his connection. Would anyone else like to speak in the meantime while Dov finds a better cell phone reception? Okay, we'll try going back to Dov again. Go ahead, Dov, let's try you again. In the meantime, perhaps Professor Stephen Popper would like to offer his reflections, having been a part of this process. Stephen?
Yes, I'd be happy.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Dan. Well, what I have to say is both trivial and all important. I'm a senior economist, analyst at the RAND Corporation. I'm an analyst by training. I live in my head, starting early in the morning and going until late at night. I, am not a maven about the frum community, but I have lots of contacts, lots of knowledge. So what I'm saying is that I pretty much knew what to expect going into our meeting here in Los Angeles. And yet I learned a great deal. I came away with a different perception of people that I thought I understood well, but found them to be that much more. Found them to be people that I could learn from just on the basis of the 2 hours we spent together. So as I say, this is a somewhat trivial insight, but it's also all important. It really brought home to me the fact that, you know, in Los Angeles and presumably by extension in other communities, there's really kind of Jewish people gold lying in the street, just waiting for us collectively to pick it up. I was very encouraged and, you know, have decided, largely in discussion with Irving, that one way or the other, we would like to continue the process.
Thank you, Stephen. We'll try to go back to Dov now. Hopefully he has a better signal.
Yes, so what I just wanted to say is that for decades and maybe centuries, the Haredi community has been separated and they have developed their own system, their own welfare, their own schools, and it's difficult to change. There is a lot of resistance to change because the things work this way. And even if a long term it will be better, people cannot do that now so easily. That's the reason if we don't have a task force with people who are backed by the top level people, or if we have a necessity, it will not work by itself. That's the reason it's really important to try to have a proactive approach to make it change. To make a change in such situation is very difficult. The only thing, let's look when it works. It was pretty well at AIPAC. We see Haredi participants to the AIPAC meetings, and it works. So why it works? Because they have adapted, Rabbi Avishai Hana said before, they adapted to the Haredi people, and the other side is there is a lot of motivation from the Haredi people. It's not the real threat to the local life they have. It's something different. It's advocacy for Israel, and it's important for all the Jews. So it's a shared interest. So this is what I would like to contribute is to say, we wait and we'll do it when it's really urgent, or we'll do it for a proactive approach if we make it on a proactive and organized effort. This is what I want to say, and I think that the virus we have now, it's an opportunity to work together, as Malcolm has said before, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dov. Anyone else care to offer a comment or ask a question? And if not, then we'll go to John, who hopefully can summarize today's presentation and discussion.
Well, I don't think I'm going to summarize. Am I on?
You're
I don't
on.
think I'm going to summarize the whole, but I want to make a comment and then 3 points. We were all talking that this crisis in some ways has exacerbated it. I respect Malcolm's notion that it could also be an opportunity, which I'll come back to. But I think here too, just like we need to recognize the differences in a community, in the New York Times today, there's a by zip code record of where this virus is taking place in the number of cases and the percentage of the population. And throughout New York, and I suspect in Israel as well, it is entirely correlated and related to the intensity of living patterns. And so there's a great deal of focus on some rabbinic injunctions, but I urge the focus, and people like ourselves need to be aware of that as well, that the intensity of demographic intensity is a huge predictor of the extent of this virus. And people like ourselves are going to need to communicate all of this because the Amcha is horrified and angry, which was, of course, will be a challenge. I like the notion of opportunity, but I just want to mention that. Dr. Windmueller correctly talked about other efforts that have taken place way back to the 1970s. I think we all remember the Synagogue Council that ultimately, in America, that ultimately was disbanded. I would say what has changed, however, since the 1970s. Number one, the present crisis is a game changer, and how all of us in Israel and here reframe it and try to understand it will be critical. Second, demography. The demographic trends revealed in population studies throughout North America predict that by 2030, 2040, you can pick your population study, the changes in North American Jewry will be dramatic. And that has enhanced our recognition that the notion of separate communities in parallel, which take place in some communities, needs to be addressed earlier rather than later, given the changes underway. The demographic patterns revealed in population studies were headlines, and I think that provides the opportunity and the recognition among elites in many communities. We need to address this. And third, I would say, reflected in some of the discussion here, is the awareness and recognition of potential areas of cooperation. What we noted at the most senior levels about the readiness of Jewish leadership to be more active in supporting government funding for day schools represents a huge opening. By the way, that's taken place in New York at the federation level. It's taking place in other communities. It's important to note because, as we all know, day school education is a huge burden in the Haredi community, a principal focus, and until recently, the quote general community has not been prepared to think creatively about where and how to be supportive of that. I think a change is taking place at the leadership level, and that provides another opportunity. So the combination of present crisis, the awareness of the demographic trends, and the recognition of the day school issue and the funding of it provides an opportunity. Add the advocacy level, which, while it has taken place by increased Haredi participation in AIPAC and other places, I think there's also an awareness some of those efforts could be strengthened in recruitment and leadership development as well, both at the local level, community relations, and at the national levels. So it seems to me that, and I credit Avinoam, who was the first to really encourage many of us who might have been a little resistant first to take this on as a dialogue subject. There's an opportunity here, and the question will be whether we can take this first step and follow it up. And it's so important that Professor Dov Maimon is going to take this to the next step, and I think many of us are prepared to help as we can. Thank you. Hope this was helpful.
Thank you, John. Shlomo, you'd like to add something?
I want to add one thing to John's very fine summation, which is that 58%, if I'm not mistaken, of the Haredi leaders said that Haredim ought to participate in funding and in planning reform and conservative education. That was an eye-opener, which is parallel to what John pointed out about the non-Orthodox community being for state aid to religious education. So we have it on both sides, and I just wanted to make that point just to elucidate that. Thank you.
Wonderful. So I think we can all agree, first of all, the fact that we're all here, we can all agree that this is an important topic and will only continue to be an important topic as we move forward and as the Haredi community becomes a bigger and bigger part of the North American, the diaspora Jewish communities. And the first stage of the dialogue showed a lot of ways forward, a lot of areas to cooperate, and the sensitivities that both sides need to show to each other. And we can only look forward to the next stage of the project, where we begin to implement a lot of these lessons and understandings going forward for a better Jewish future for all of us. So thank you all for participating, and hope to see you at the next JPPI webinar.
And may we all be safe and our families.
Be always safe and healthy. Yes, thank you.
I want to thank everybody too, and to say Chag Sameach. I know it's a different Chag this time. Thank you, John. Thank you, Shlomo, and thank you, Dov and Dan. The growth of the Frum community is very significant, and this is a huge challenge to our unity. Thank you, everybody.
Chag Sameach, and stay safe, everyone. Stay safe and be well.
Thank you too.
Bye-bye. Be well.
Bye-bye. Chag Sameach, everybody.
Chag Sameach, everyone.
John, see you next week.